phone up here. Sounds good. Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. I'm Teresa Acuna. I'm a mid-career alum from 2017. This weekend has been incredible. Seeing everyone after such tough years that we've faced, to be apart and to be together again really means a lot. We've even got to enjoy our beautiful campus and been blessed with this nice, balmy weather in New England. But as our weekend comes to a close, we're gonna finish it out with a conversation on leadership and how we confront the big challenges of our time. Please help me welcome Abdi Ismail, also mid-career class of 2017. Abdi has been working in the humanitarian field for the past 15 years, and I personally have just so much respect for what he does and the change that he's making. Also with us today is the incomparable David Gergen. Faculty and founding director of the Center for Public Leadership, and who also just recently published this book, Hearts Touched with Fire. Please pick it up. We have extra copies somewhere behind this curtain. So welcome. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Teresa. All right. Well, first of all, it's a wonderful experience to be here and back to the JFK Forum after so many years, after 5 years that we were last here. Many of you also have been around here. I just wanted to really take this opportunity to thank all the organizers and all those who made this incredible reunion weekend a success, who have poured so much effort and so much work over the last few months. I just wanted to invite you to perhaps put your hands together for them because this has been incredible. Thank you. Well done. So, David, I've been looking forward to this conversation with you and with your new book, Hearts Touched with Fire, How Leaders Are Made. It's a wonderful book about leadership and on leadership and leaders. It talks about what is being a leader. You talk about what are the crucible moments, what it takes to really be a leader in the 21st century. And you talk about a lot of old-timers, FDR, you talk about Churchill, John Lewis, RBG, but also you talk about new generations of leaders, the ones who we ought to give the baton to take us further in our renewal as a society. So we will be delving deep into all of these questions and we will be unpacking many of these. But before, you know all David Gergen, of course, so there's no further introduction that is needed. You have been an advisor and speech writer for 4 US presidents, Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and a Democrat, Bill Clinton. You have been and are professor of public service. You founded the Center for Public Leadership here at the Harvard Kennedy School. Your broadcasting experience includes PBS, senior analyst for CNN. You've studied both at Harvard and Yale. You are accomplished, published author. So, you have a very, very important pedigree and a classic overachiever profile.
I just found out that you're actually have accepted a fellowship at Yale.
Yes.
Is that true? How did we let you get away?
I felt, yeah, that was, I wanted to keep under the law, especially being here.
Well, congratulations.
Well, thank you very much, David. So, I mean, we have really, you don't really need any further introduction, and I think everybody here knows you, both the domestic audience, but also the international colleagues and friends who have come to this reunion weekend. But perhaps before we go into leadership and what leadership is all about, and your experiences in working with so many great leaders, and being a leader yourself, of course, perhaps I wanted to ask you a little bit about this wonderful book and the title of this wonderful book, Hearts Touched with Fire.
Yes.
It's such a peculiar name. Where does it, Untitled, where does it come from? What's the story behind it?
Well, it's a good question. And first of all, let me say how appreciative I am of all of you coming back for a reunion. I had a sense just walking around in the last day or so that there's a lot of energy, a lot of excitement with this. The numbers of you who signed up exceeded what was expected. And there were just a lot of good things coming out of that. And I hope you all feel that you've had a good visit and you've been energized, re-energized by the Kennedy School. This is, as you come to learn in life, this is one of the most important institutions in our American and international life. And in turn, so you have the keys to so much of what is going to happen in the future. That's one of the reasons I wrote the book. We'll talk about it more. But in any event, in thinking about a title, I was very moved. I went to law school here after, I went to Yale as an undergraduate, and then came here to law school. And an iconic figure at the Harvard Law School at that time was Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., and he came from a very prominent family here in Boston. His father was a major doctor. His mom was very important, and they were affluent, if not wealthy. But they had a lot of social power. And when Abraham Lincoln issued his first call for volunteers in the Civil War, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who was then 23 here in college, could have ducked. In those days, if you had the money, you could buy your way out of going to fight. That's what happened to Teddy Roosevelt's father, who ducked and it embarrassed his son. So that Roosevelt became a determined nationalist and very muscular in power, and you know, was also took on a lot of heat because he felt embarrassed that father didn't volunteer. Well, Oliver Wendell Holmes did volunteer. Off he went, and in 3 battles, going through Chancellorsville and 2 other communities there. In 3 different battles, he was grievously wounded in each one. And on the last time around, he was left on the battlefield to die. Miraculously, he recovered. But then interestingly, he was a very reflective man. He went on to become Justice of the Supreme Court, named by TR, lasted until FDR. But Holmes miraculously lived through that experience. 20 years after the war, 1884, he gave a talk on Memorial Day reflecting on what the Civil War had meant to his generation, to the people who volunteered. What role did it play in his life? And he made the argument that everyone has to be a person in the passions of his time or her time. That if you really want to live, you have to be and live in those passions. And he said, to our great good fortune, talking about the men who also volunteered, to our great good fortune, it was given to us to fight these great battles, and our hearts were touched with fire. As if what moved him, what had come out, was not just the battle. He had discovered things in himself by serving others. And it was a critical part of his upbringing. He was, as I say, a figure that many in this community emulated for a long, long time. And I think the phrase, hearts touched with fire, captures so well what people who have lives of service have discovered. That you won't make the money, you won't necessarily have much fun, you probably are going to be working long hours, and you have to be very patient, and even then it doesn't work very well. You have to put up with all that. But at the end of the day, you do have something that people who've just gone in for money don't have, and that is you have a fulfillment, some sense of what it is to be a human being and to serve. Leadership is ultimately about service. That's why we call people servant leaders. But it's ultimately about service to others. And that is something we try to, I think we need to all take aboard in our own lives about sort of where do we fit in, what difference does my life make? You know, where am I going? This is something Ron Heifetz talks a lot about here at the school. We have others who talk about it at the school. This book is an attempt to sort of wrestle with some of those questions. And I'll be interested in how you respond, but let's go on. That's where the phrase comes from. Okay.
That's a wonderful story, and I think it is really the essence of leadership, no? The passion, the fulfillment, and the drive that it gives you to be a better person and to lead in a search of common goals. So, what prompted you to write this new book on leadership that we've talked about?
Well, I came here in 1999 from Washington, D.C. I'd been involved with a number of administrations there, as you heard. And I first went to Washington in a naval uniform in the late 60s, and I did a year's Navy service there in Washington, and then went to work in the White House by accident. It was a complete accident. And when I came here, I came with a great sense of disappointment in the leadership we had in Washington, on both sides of the aisle. I just felt we weren't doing what we should do, and that if I came here, I'd have an opportunity to rub shoulders and be in a group of people who still had great promise, whose lives weren't written out yet, but they had all this promise that you could just see. And at a time when there's so much gloom and pessimism, and I share in some of that. I'm a short-term pessimist, but I'm increasingly a long-term optimist. And I think as you look over the horizon, you can see glimmerings now of things that should make us hopeful. And I wanted to write about that. I teach a class here. I've been teaching a class here. I wanted to have something I could talk to students about that I had written. And I also wanted the book, in some ways, to be something of a legacy, as sort of a summing up, if you would. I've reached an age where, I just recently turned 80, and given that, you don't exactly feel you have a long runway at that point. But I really wanted to, and as I was writing it, especially during the pandemic, the urgency of the moment became so much more apparent that we don't have, just as we're on the climate, we're running out of time. We're running out of time in our politics too. We can't go on this way. The path we're on is unsustainable. And I wanted to do everything I could to make a difference there. I'll tell you, the nice thing about getting older is that you can say things that you wouldn't say otherwise. You can be a little more candid, but you also can be funny. And I was thinking, there's a famous story about Joseph Schumpeter, and those of you who've been and studied the economics, he was a major economist. In any event, when he was 80, there was a dinner for him here at Harvard, and at the end of it, he got up to say, well, he had always had three great aspirations in life. One was to be the world's greatest economist. The second was to be the world's greatest lover. And the third was to be the world's greatest horseman. He said, now that I'm 80, I'm afraid I must give up my aspiration to be the world's greatest horseman.
Excellent. How do you move from that? Well, all right, let's try to go back to leadership. So, in your book, you talk a lot about the requisite skills for leadership and for leaders that are coming up in this new world.
Yeah, let's move that back.
Oh, thank you. Is there a difference in terms of requisite skills between the leaders in the public arena and those in the private sector?
Are the qualities that are needed?
Correct. Yeah.
I think increasingly they are the same. There was a long time that capitalism was over here on one end of the spectrum, and politics and public life was over here on another end of the spectrum. And there was always this sort of how do you control the other one? How do you regulate the other one or get what you want out of that system? But today, increasingly, I think it's legitimate, although there are days when I think we're being fooled and it's all about PR. But I sense that corporate CEOs are moving much more affirmatively in the direction of making sure that their companies are good citizens. You know, Deloitte has done a big survey on this, and they have found that a growing number of people coming out of business school, or places like this, you know, McKinsey or whatever, that when they're interviewing for a job, they want to know about the role of that company in our public life, and if it's something one can admire, then they're more likely to go. But they won't go and work for just any company anymore. They don't want to be associated with that, especially on the environment, but on so many other things. And so there are a lot of really important new initiatives that are underway in the corporate community. And I'm hoping, I recently went and heard a talk by Ken Chenault and Ken Frazier. They're two major African black CEOs, major corporations. And they were just fascinating because they were so committed to the public weal and trying to make this a better country and trying to make employment opportunities more real, that they've started an organization called 110. It's all, CEOs sign up for this, but it's called 110. There's a friend of mine named Gerald Chertavian who runs a group called Year Up. Some of you are nodding your head. He was a graduate of the business school. Year Up is a nonprofit that really helps people going to community colleges and things like that who have sort of essentially dropped out to get them back on track and get them going toward jobs. And they do a splendid job. And Gerald is working with Frazier and Chenault and other CEOs to create, their goal is to create 1 million new jobs over the next 10 years for black Americans. 1 million new jobs over the next 10 years. And they're starting out on it. They're making serious progress because they think it's real. And it's their contribution. So that, in that sense, I think there is a somewhat similar need on both. Government and the nonprofit world. The nonprofit world has to do a much better job of figuring out how to change systems. There are people who've started small nonprofits who've done extremely well, but they're small. There is a group that does a lot to help farmers in Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa become self-sufficient, and what they have found is that over 20 or 30 years they've reached 3 million farmers. That's a terrific number. That's a huge number, right? So I had to talk with the guy who runs this, who started this nonprofit, and I said, well, you've helped 3 million. How many are there who need this training? And they said 50 million. Now, when you hear those kind of comparisons, you realize the nonprofit world can't do this all by itself. The nonprofit world can be innovative. The nonprofit world can give inspiration. The nonprofit world can set up models. But then you have to sort of, there's no guarantee that they're going to work. Just look at what goes on in charter schools. And charter schools came out of the nonprofit world as an idea. Wendy Kopp, with Teach for America, in our Princeton dorm room. It's on her senior year, was looking for something to do. She came up with Teach for America. And her husband now is a CEO of KIPP, the KIPP schools, best charter schools in the country. But yet, they're having a really hard time because the teachers' unions are coming after them. So you can't assure, and the teachers' unions have an argument, you guys are creaming off the top and we're losing some of our best students to you. But black parents are lining up saying, we want the best education our kid can have. We're not trying to make him a role model. We want an education. And you have an obligation to try to teach this child. There are legitimate arguments on both sides of that equation. But you've got to be then open to, okay, how are we going to solve this problem? You don't want to have the two big teachers unions spending half their time on politics. I talked to the CEO of KIPP, I told you, married to Wendy Kopp, and he told me privately, this was 5 years ago, he said it's gotten to the point on the charter school movement that 1 out of every $4 that he raises has to go into politics, to recruiting people who will support charter schools in the state legislatures and the city councils and the school boards and that sort of thing. So we have obvious tensions that are also hold us back. And at some level, if we're going to solve some of these problems, we've got to be able to put down some of the differences between industries or between nonprofit versus for-profit or nonprofit versus public education, those kinds of questions. And I think we have a long way to go on that. It's, it's harder than it looks. I mean, it's amazing to me how long we've been at trying to reform the schools, the public schools, and how little progress we've made. We're doing better on dropout rates. City Year, which is here in Boston, its headquarters here. It's a wonderful nonprofit organization that has been really focused now on dropout rates. And they've had some encouraging progress in certain schools. But again, it's the system that it's not working. And it hasn't gotten where it is. That's the frustration level for people going into it. So there's a lot of work to be done here. But on the other hand, if you all don't do it, I don't know who will. I don't see a lot of volunteers out there to come in from Lorraine to help. What I see is an encouraging number of young people who are stepping up themselves, and I think making a big difference. And we're in a period where, when you're young, you can have more impact now than you could have. Partly because of social media. It's a part of the two-edged sword quality that social media has. Social media is producing a lot of junk and disinformation, but on the other hand, it does give access to people who wouldn't otherwise have a voice. So it's a good thing. It just we're so poisoned in our discourse, our public discourse, and I want to come back to this as a generational argument. I have increasing doubts that the generation that's in power today can fix things. The baby boom generation. I think it's very, very unlikely the baby boom generation is going to fix these problems. And it's why I think increasingly, looking long term, we're going to need to rely on younger generations to come forward. The millennials and Generation Z, I think, are going to be extremely important. In the near term, Generation X can be very important. It's been overlooked so much and should be have more time at bat. But I think the long term interest of the country rests very strongly in how well can we prepare the younger generations, how well can they prepare themselves to be good servant leaders in the future. And that to me is one of the great tests of our time.
Very interesting. Thank you. Thank you very much for these thoughtful. Let's discuss a little bit perhaps your career. Let's take a step back on leadership.
It consisted of getting out of town before the sheriff got there.
So you're from North Carolina. You grew up in Durham, around Duke also, and you went to university at Yale. You went to law school at Harvard. Were you interested in public service? Were you interested in getting into the arena at that stage, or is something that kind of evolved?
No, when I was young, I wanted to be an athlete.
Oh, okay.
I wanted to be a professional athlete, and then something happened. I was a baseball player, and I was pretty good at it. And we went to the state championship, things like that. And then between junior high school and high school, I shot up in terms of my size. I gained about 6 inches in 6 or 8 months. And I really became extremely awkward as an individual. If you see me walking today, you think, who is that goofy guy? But I became awkward. And I went out with the first tryout I had for the baseball team, for the high school baseball team. It was raining that day, and then we went into a gym to pitch. And I threw about 4 or 5 pitches. It went pretty well. But then I took a ball and threw it really hard. And that ball went through a window. That wasn't the worst of it. The window was on the second floor. So I knew at that moment, I have no future in active sports. And I became a sports writer. I started working for the morning newspaper, the Durham Morning Herald in North Carolina. And I would go to football games and go up and down the sidelines, writing down plays and that sort of thing. And at halftime, I would go up in a rickety old box and do commentary on the radio. And I was like 16 years old, 17 years old. What the hell did I know? Not much. But anyway, and then after the game was over, my dad would drive me to the newspaper offices, and he'd sit outside and smoke while I went in and found the keys, and I had to get my copy in by midnight. But the next day when you woke up, there was a big headline, and my name was in it. And that turned me on. It was really, and so I went from writing about sports. I used a bridge. I wrote obituaries for a while. But then I started doing, we had a lot of schools around like UNC and Duke and so forth, their basketball teams, and I covered that. But I started covering state and local politics, and I had a route that I followed to go talk to the city manager and talk to this person and that person. And that was really good. That was really good training for me. I went to work pretty much full time at 15 or 16. And I enjoyed it. I worked with a bunch of older guys who were graduates of journalism school, and they were great fun. And they taught me how to drink beer and do a lot of things, But I do want to say that I write in the book that from that experience of being with the newspaper, there came a time when I decided that I was going to. I was invited and to be an intern, working for Terry Sanford, who was our new governor in North Carolina. Terry Sanford, very charismatic. He was our Jack Kennedy, and he could really persuade people to come and do work for him. And they assigned me to some job over at the Commerce Department at first, and I called and said, you got to get me out of here. I want to work on civil rights, because it was very hot then. It was 62, 63. And Cheney and these three guys got murdered in Mississippi. Was that shadow was hanging over everything. At any event, I got a job with something called the North Carolina Good Neighbor Council. It consisted of one man with a secretary. But he was a leading citizen of our state. He was a strong segregationist who had an epiphany and had become an integrationist, strong integrationist. And his role was to drive around the state, meet at night with leading blacks and leading citizens who were white, and get them to focus on mutual interest in jobs and in education. And by the way, to keep the peace. It was very important to keep the peace. And this David Coltrane, I went to work for David Coltrane. I was his driver. I was his policy guy. I was his communications director. I swept the floors. I mean, I did damn near anything they wanted me to do just because. But what I want to say is that experience, working directly with people and feeling you can get your hands dirty and feeling you could see progress, I found more fulfilling than any service I did in the White House. It was something that struck me as being, it was just so personalized. And it wasn't, in Washington, it's a lot about pushing buttons and writing regulations, and then you really don't see, and you can't see what's happening, and you don't realize how burdensome some of those regulations are and how liberating some of the other ones are. You don't have that kind of quality of life. And I found this to be a great quality of life. It was also, frankly, dangerous in those days. The Klan was very big in our state, down in the southwestern part of the state. I had a good friend I've gone to high school with who was working the first summer I did this when we agreed. He was working in a church, a black church. He was an associate pastor for the summer. And he and I agreed we were going to go watch a Klan rally. He was going to tape record it so he could bring it back to his parishioners and let them see what it took some of the terror out of worrying about the Klan if you're black. So anyway, we went to this rally. There were four of us wound up being in the car together. Went there. There were cops all over the place in this great big field. They were out on the entrance to the field, cops all over the place. As soon as you got inside the place, cops disappeared. And the order was given to a bunch of burly guys in brown shirts who looked like they're going to, they just didn't get rid of you right there if they could. And we went and watched the rally. The Klan people came around and stole our tape recorder. But then when we went back to our car, when it was over, there must have been 300 people surrounding that car and yelling at us. And we were able to get in, but then they started dancing on the roof. They were banging on the windows. They were yelling at us. They were determined that we would never do that again. We would never come their way again. And frankly, I thought we might get killed. I was really concerned about it. So I told the driver, Russell, listen, just get the key in the ignition. Turn it on, and let's gently start moving. We have no other choice. We're not going to get out of here if we don't do that. And he did, and they started to part as we got through. But then they all went and jumped in their cars, and then they chased us down these dark highways. And it was very scary. I I thought in the end, I made a mistake. I was reckless in taking people or going with people out there. And it was like we were guilty of sort of waving a red flag in front of a bull. And it was sort of like they could easily read that as us elitists coming in, looking down at them, just they're animals in a zoo. And people resent that kind of stuff, and it's one of the reasons they get so angry. And we need to clean up our act. But I can just tell you, going back to this, that I have vivid memories of those times. And when I sometimes feel I didn't really contribute very much, I can go back there and feel some solace.
No, it must have been scary, and perhaps there are some parallels to be drawn with what's happening today in the world, and particularly in terms of race relations and so on.
Right.
But that's a different chapter to engage in. Perhaps I think we're running out of time, but maybe I'll ask you a couple of more questions, and then perhaps open the floor for further questions.
Sure.
So you start this experience that you've just described now, and then you move into politics. You start working with 4 presidents.
Yep.
How would you compare these 4 very different individuals, that you've worked with, from Nixon to Ford to Reagan and Clinton?
Do you want to have breakfast together? They were very different people, but I would say that the 4 presidents I worked for, they were all patriotic in their own way. They took seriously the responsibilities of the job. And for that, I appreciate it. But did I learn some things? Yeah, you bet. And I try to record some of it in the book. But Nixon showed me he was the best strategist I've ever met in public life, save maybe Henry Kissinger. But they could sort of figuratively go up on a mountaintop and look into the past. And as Churchill argued, he who can see farther back can see farther ahead. And they could often do that, and they came up with the idea of sort of splitting. The Soviets and the Chinese at that point were joined at the hip. They were going to destroy us, and Kissinger went to China in order to split them apart, which occurred. And it was like, that really worked out very, very well. I don't know quite why we seem to be talking up the storm about the possibility they're going to get back together, and we're going to encourage them to get back together. I do not understand what we're trying to do. I mean, when you wake up in the morning and the morning headline is, we're edging closer to a possible war, why are we not waking up to a headline that says we're edging closer to diplomacy? I don't get it, but it's an issue we can talk more about.
Very true. No, absolutely. I think again, it's quite disheartening when you see the direction in which things are going.
Now I wanted to ask you a question because we're going to the floor, right?
Sure.
Well, I want to know. We talked about this a little bit before we came out. You're working for the International Committee of the Red Cross. That's a really, really important organization. You're in Switzerland, and you're doing the Lord's work doing it. But I do have a sense of disappointment when Ukraine hit. The world didn't turn to the UN. It was just sort of written off as an institution right from the beginning. And there were so many institutions that some institutions really came and performed well, but there was less help coming from all these institutions we built up since World War II, that they're not quite working the way we are. Thank goodness, Sweden and Finland are coming in, into NATO. But it's been a process that has left some questions about where we are. I'm curious what your view is. The role of international institutions.
Right. Well, I mean, I'm not sure I'm the right person to talk on behalf of the UN or what the UN has been doing or not. But I think I think from the perspective of the Red Cross in particular, and in delivering humanitarian assistance and in responding to the conflict and the events that unraveled from the invasion, I think what has happened is that many people were caught off guard.
Many people what?
Were caught off guard. Despite everybody expecting that this would happen, really not everybody. I think the percentage of people who really felt that Putin would really go into Ukraine, despite a lot of intelligence, despite a lot of talk, there was always a back in the mind of many people that this would not happen and this was just a bluff.
Yeah.
So when it happened, obviously it caught off guard a lot of actors, including a lot of humanitarian actors who did not have any preparedness, who did not have any any means to respond, any personnel,
Yeah.
and so on and so forth. But the big challenge is in relation to, you know, how will Europe define its own security structure, and what does that mean for Russia?
Yeah.
And of course for Ukraine and the Baltic states and the Scandinavian states and of course the US. So it's really a complex question that I think
Yeah.
we haven't really.
So there's some sense, and I'll stop then. There's some sense that the world has looked at us, some of our adversaries have looked at us and said, you guys had a red line in Syria, then you backed down. You guys had this invasion from Ukraine, you never really took it seriously to start with when they went into the Crimea, and basically you've not been willing to commit in a full-time way. Do we need to be doing something more before we get into a similar conclusion about Taiwan? Before the Chinese, embrace that view?
It's just any volunteers? Any hands up? No? Are you sure? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I think there is a clear direction that the world is heading from, you know, the bipolar back in the days with the Soviet and the Americans, and then into you know, one polar world where the West was more or less dominating and leading the way. Certainly, that is no longer the case, and I think the way forward is to try to figure out how to cooperate between the Europeans, the Americans, the Russians, the Chinese, the BRICS, and everybody else, and not to forget 54 African countries that, you know, that have also a power there. So where do we go from here? I think the key element is trying to figure out how to bring about a system that kind of like has a fairness weaved into it, unlike the current system that we have, and which is what has been causing a lot of problems. And the United Nations, I think, has been championing some sort of reform to try to create a little bit that space for global infrastructure and the new world order that is distributed.
I agree. Going back to the earlier bit of our conversation, you said systems. The systems have got to change. So this is another example when what's going on in the corporate sector, what's going on in the nonprofit sector, and what's going on in the government, you know, there are some parallels.
Yeah, very true, very true.
Yeah.
Very
Why
true.
don't we go to the floor?
Should we go to the floor?
Please.
All right. Okay. So, yes, please. Thank you. Thank you, Betsy. So come down to the microphone. Exactly. The ground rules are that you state your name and your affiliation, and you make your question with a question mark at the end to it, please.
And could you please speak up?
And please speak up.
For those of us who are hearing impaired.
Of course. So there's already one person there. Please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Orly, and I'm a mid-career MPA 1997. And I heard you also in the past, and I would like to ask you, seeing the characteristics and the skills leaders needed in the past, and taking into consideration the future, the technology, and the new culture of the young generations, what do you think will be the best skills and characteristics of the next leaders to lead the world and countries?
I couldn't understand the question.
So if we understood correctly, what are the characteristics of the next generation of leaders in David's eyes?
Yeah, comparing to us,
To the
that
current,
we are a completely different generation.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think the needs of leadership are changing, and one of the biggest changes is that in leadership studies, we often used to talk about the great man, the coming of the great man on a white horse. He's going to rescue us. We need the great man on a white horse. And that's perhaps best captured by a photograph of John F. Kennedy when he was president in the Oval Office at dusk, alone, hunched over a desk, and it seemed the weight of the world was upon his shoulders, that he was the only thing saving us from carnage. And so that was the great man you had to assess. If you go up to the Obama administration, what's the most memorable, one of the most memorable photographs from that administration is taken down in the Situation Room when President Obama is there with his Secretary of State, his Secretary of Defense, his head of his CIA, his top military person, plus 2 or 3 other people. And it's a group. And increasingly, we need constructive collaboration among groups, with the group itself and then working with other groups. That's where progress can be made. There's an old African proverb that if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think there's a lot of wisdom to that. That there are other things. I think transparency, the willingness to live with a loss of privacy, which increasingly in public life you're just going to be stripped of it. But I also think, very, very importantly, a wide bandwidth. That you have to be able to. The best way to explain this is there's a T model. It's called the T model that McKinsey has. That says that essentially, as professionals, among professionals, you want to have one area that they're particularly strong and distinctive in, and that's a sort of a vertical line. And then you want to have a whole series of things they have some knowledge of, and that's the horizontal line. And they form a T, and you look for both. It's increasingly, that's the way universities are selecting their classes now. That there used to be that major universities would look for well-rounded people, and you did a bit of this, you did a bit of that, and that determined your fate. Now increasingly, universities are looking for someone with real talent, serious talent, that's part of that T process. And then what they want to do is put together a group of people who have different strengths. It's almost like forming an orchestra. You need the violin, but you also need the cello, and you need the flute, and if you get outstanding people in all of those positions, you've got a much better chance of making good music. That's not the only ingredient. Sometimes you can be just a team of really talented people who don't work well together, and you lose. That happens in sports, and Olympic sports, quite frequently. We get these all-stars, but they can't play together, and they lose to Lithuania. So it's an issue that you have to take on. That I think that developing an area of real strength, and I try to deal with this in the book. That I do think you're better off taking a strength and trying to go from good to great than you are taking a place where you're good to mediocre and seeing if you can get to good. I mean, what you want to do is get to excellence, and so it's a different approach. What it does require, I think, is much more self-awareness and self-mastery. That you have to, and that means you got to be able to take a lot of good. Let me go back to Nixon, for example. I was started off way back there. Nixon, best strategist, as I said, I've ever known, and he and Kissinger would talk. They'd sit in the morning and compare generals in the First World War, what they did, how they did it. Henry's got a book on leadership coming out. I think sometime this summer. I think it's been a bit delayed. He's 99 years old. He's 99 years old. It's unbelievable. But I think overall, more is expected of leaders today than was expected in the past. It's easier to get recognition earlier in life through the social media. AOC can become an instant overnight person. We all know who she is, right? So it's easy to get to the top very fast. Once you get to the top, it's extremely hard to govern. It's become much harder to govern and to get things done. And it's quite easy to slide off the power. One mistake and you can be pulverized for that. So it's a harder game to play, and it's particularly frustrating that we don't have better results. But that's why, again, we're going to be looking so much to you guys to come up with a better way of doing things. We can't come up with a worse way of doing things.
Yes, indeed, unfortunately. Let me ping pong between back and forth, so please go ahead.
Professor, thanks. Armin Meyer, MPPO2. Picking up exactly on the remarks you were making. We were having a debate last night over drinks. Like, is the type of person who runs for office today very dissimilar from the type of people you worked for because of how the game has changed so much? Or are we just seeing it without the long arc of history, and in fact, things aren't that different? And just to put a little more punch on that, we were hypothesizing that there's certainly altruistic drivers, as you've mentioned, from the four folks you worked for. But we were kind of wondering, have things gotten like darker and more negative? Or are the personalities different to take on this new world of social and otherwise?
Well, I think it goes back to a generational point, which I've oversimplified. But I do think that the culture sort of throws up people, and you have to work the culture produces certain kinds of people. Like, you have Newt Gingrich, who then is successful in the House, and other people start copying him. Suddenly, the Gingricisms, apply in the House. Then they move over to the Senate, and they infect the Senate because congressmen run for office in the Senate. And then when they get to the Senate, they move to the White House, as we've seen with Trump. And so you have to. It is a fact of life, and it's something we got to keep beating back on and pushing really, really hard. Now, one of the reasons I have some optimism about the future is I think there are a couple of streams of people now coming into our political life who are encouraging. I speak of one group that I'm personally involved with is trying to find, identify, support, mentor, help raise money for veterans coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan and having an interest in running for public office. There was a young man named Rod Barcott who went here to the Kennedy School. That's where I met him here. He was my teaching assistant, but he also went to the business school. He started a group called With Honor. It's a nonprofit group, and disclosure, I'm chairman of his advisory board. And we, a couple of times ago, we had 20 people who won with our support, with our endorsement. 10 Republicans and 10 Democrats. It's on both sides of the aisle. And if you're going to do this, you have to sign a pledge that you will work with the other side of the aisle. And what we're seeing now is there's a caucus in the House of Representatives called Our Country. Leon Panetta's son is co-chair of that. And it's a first-rate, and so I'm seeing some really first-rate people come in. Some of them are also getting their heads banged in. You take Connor Lamb in Pennsylvania. He's Pennsylvania. He looked like a perfect candidate, and he was a Marine. He'd done all these other things. Turned out he took it too much for granted this time around. He's going down. But there are others who are still hanging in there, and they're going to be more running. So we're trying to get the numbers back up. I'm persuaded, perhaps wrongly, that one of the reasons we had the good politics we did in the late 40s, early in the 50s, and into the early 60s, was that people had fought under the same flag, and that because they had that, they had a lot of respect for each other, and that made a big difference in their capacity. People who fight under the same flag together tend to be happily working together. And I found there's numerous instances of people I knew in the World War II generation who worked together and liked working together. Here's Reagan, the most conservative president we've had in a long time, and Tip O'Neill, the most liberal Speaker of the House we've had in a long time. They're on opposite ends of the political spectrum. They start working together when they're in office, and they did pretty darn well. They got tax reform done, and they got Social Security reform done. Those are big, major accomplishments at the time. And they didn't trust each other in the beginning, but they had a rule that up until 5 o'clock in the afternoon, you could bang the other guy over the head. You could call him all the names publicly you wanted. But at 5 o'clock, you put down your differences, and you could lift up a glass, and they like to have us sort of, kick back and tell old Irish yarns and one thing and another. So I remember when Tip had a big birthday, a 65th or 70th, and Reagan decided to give a luncheon for him down at the White House. Invited a lot of Tip's friends. They had a big group. And when lunch was over, Reagan got up and he'd written out this little doggerel, this little poem. He liked doggerel. And he said, "Tip, if I had a ticket to heaven, and you didn't have one too, well, I'd give my ticket back and go to hell with you. That was the spirit of the time, and they got along pretty well. The first time I ever went to George H.W. Bush's house, he invited me up to Kennebuck once when he was running, and I went for the weekend, and I walked in, there's a huge, big Democratic congressman there for the weekend, and that would never happen today. You wouldn't be caught dead in that situation today, and there's a fear. But these military people face it down. Kinzinger, for example, is a good example of someone say, we're not doing that. And he's walking, but he's doing it in an honorable way. And Liz Cheney is doing it in an honorable way. So that's one stream. But the other stream is, I think we're seeing a growing number of people of color, especially black women, who are emerging as moral leaders of our time. And I don't share their politics in many cases. I'm to the right of them on the politics. I'm not far right, but I'm to the right of them. But I celebrate the fact that they've gotten in the arena and they're pushing for it and they're not going to give up. And so you get the Me Too movement formed by somebody who's in her 20s. Black Lives Matter, 3 black women, all late 20s, early 30s. These are young people by comparison to what we have from older generations. And I've been raising the argument, I don't want to have this get too far here, but I've been raising the argument since the book was written about the generational changes. We need to, the baby boom population needs to start stepping back more. It's time for the baton to pass. It's time for the torch to pass. And we need more of the younger generation invited in, and we ought to work with them and prepare them to do that, because I don't see how we're going to get there unless we take this seriously. And those black women who are, they're taking a lot of risks in life, you'll notice that they're now starting a propaganda war against the Black Lives Matter because, they've got some house they've been, a bunch of them have been in. It's a $6 million house. This is an example of its hypocrisy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's not. And these people are doing admirable things. And I'd love to have us have a parade of people like that coming through the county school. I think you having a chance to sort of rub shoulders with, and talk to, and come to know, and see the passion that these people bring and the commitment they bring, you'd really be impressed. And that's why I think, we're going through a rough patch right now. It's really rough. It's going to get better if we hang in there. Thank you.
Yes, sir, please go ahead.
Class of 92, mid-career program, a hanger-on. My spouse was the graduate. I have been involved in the United Nations Association of America for a while, and at an annual meeting at Bates College in Lewiston, Maine, which is a very good private college, there were a large number of students there, and this is not the first time I've heard this, but a large group of women agreeing, these are students, I would assume they were in the age of 20, plus or minus, all said they were not going to have children. I wonder what you would say to those women, certainly within the context of having an upcoming generation with role models as parents that could teach, that could lead them into leadership roles.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I understood fully correctly, and I don't want to oversimplify the question. Are you asking what the views are, what his views are on women having or not having children, and the impact of that on the generational change?
Within the context of leadership, what would you say to these women as you are talking about upcoming generations being prepared and able to lead in the future?
Say to them about, generally?
About not wanting to have children?
Not wanting to have children?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's such a personal decision. I would be very hesitant.
Okay, thank you. Aaron, please, go ahead.
Hi, my name's Aaron Axe. I'm I remember now. I'm class of 2017, mid-career MPA. I'm one of those veterans who ran for office and lost in 2018 for state delegate in Annapolis. And one of our other classmates, Dan Moy, unfortunately lost his primary as a moderate Republican in Charlottesville, Virginia, last night. I had the pleasure of taking your class in 2016 in the fall semester, and you assigned all of us a project in small groups with Wayne Caremark co-teaching with you. We had to predict the outcome of elections for all of the state level races, governor and senate, as well as the presidential race. And one group, unfortunately I was not in it, but one group actually predicted Trump to win the 2016 election. And I remember we all kind of gave them a rough time when they briefed out their project. And I heard actually a rumor that they actually got a B+ on their paper because it was graded before the election. However, Caesar crossed the Rubicon a few weeks later after we turned in the assignment. And at the end of this semester, you challenged us all in your closing speech. You challenged us all as leaders, as future leaders of this country, as that next generation, saying that we had an obligation to go into that administration and serve as America's best and brightest for relative terms. And a few of us pushed back. I was one of them and pushed back. We saw Steve Bannon get appointed to the National Security Council, at least temporarily. We saw the rhetoric that was coming out of the administration already, and we pushed back because we wanted representation of all of us, not just the far right. We wanted a president that was going to represent all of us. And I wonder, sir, if you would potentially give us your reflection after having watched that administration for 4 years and the potential, how close we are potentially to be seeing a repeat in 2024. With what just happened in Pennsylvania a couple of nights ago, I think we have to think about that as a real possibility right now. Would you provide the same advice to us, or compel us to do the same thing, or would you revise those comments in some way? That's my question.
Well, I think you really have to hang in. This is not going to happen very quickly. And know one thing: the right takes its politics very seriously. They're a 24/7 operation. And they're going to try to whip you coming and going. This is not a friendship deal. And so I think if you cede the territory, if you just sort of retreat, it's easy for a few years, but you'll find you'll wake up to a very different America, and one I think a lot of us are going to find extremely uncomfortable. And we're going to Canada will build a wall to keep Americans out. I wish there were ways to wave a wand and have all the veterans elected. The problem that faces a number of them, and this is an example, is you tend to, if you're going to run as an independent kind of voice in your party, let's say as a Republican, you're going to have other people who are going to be after you. You're either going to be in a safe district, which you can win, but you probably, you've always got to worry about somebody outflanking you, or more likely, a lot of these veterans are going into districts that are very close, and so they lose a disproportionate number of seats. But that does not mean it's a bad idea. What it does mean is there are going to be some people who get through. Who are, I think, make a major difference. Let me give you another example. I don't know how many of you know a person named Eric Lesser, who went here to the college. And the first time I met him, he was working for David Axelrod. He was sort of his keeper outside his door in the West Wing. And Eric is blessed with a lot of strengths, very, very wise man. And instead of going high for his first job in politics, he went low. He went in, he started running for low-level positions. He got into the state legislature. He's done extremely well in the state legislature, and now he's running for lieutenant governor. And he's probably going to win. And we're shaking heads about in an affirmative way here. I think he did something very wise, and that was he went and paid his dues at the local level before he got too far down the track. There's another young woman, Maura Sullivan, who went here to the Kennedy School. She was one of our early fellows. And she went and jumped very quickly. She was looking for a place to run. She was a veteran. looking for a place to run, and she found a seat in New Hampshire she thought would be good. And she declared, she went like that, and she got a little in front of her skis, and wound up losing that first race because people felt she was, she wasn't one of them. She didn't pay the neighborhood dues that you do if people think you're serious. You spend time in the neighborhood, you get to know people, and it's an investment of time and effort and money. But anyway, Maura lost first time out, but then she turned around and decided, I'm going to go back and pay my dues, and she spent the next 2 or 3 years doing that, and she's now a very viable political figure in New Hampshire. I don't know if she's going to run again or not, but she waited it through. That happens. Bill Clinton, first time he won, he went to become governor for 2 years. Next time he ran, he got his head handed to him in Arkansas, and then he came back, and then he won. He didn't lose again for a long time. So their perseverance and just sheer fortitude and commitment to it. And I also feel, look, there's some districts that are too hard, and you can't possibly win. You might want to look at find some other way to do public service. There are a lot of things that can be done. But I think, in particular, I think those of you who come to the Kennedy School, I think score high marks in this. But what we need in the country as a whole is we need national service. We need a program that is serious about encouraging everyone between the ages of 18 and 24 to give a year back to their community. I think it's really important if you could, you give a year, we'll knock a year off your tuition debt. You give another year, we'll knock another year off. And plus you get paid some minimal salaries. And what will happen if they're in AmeriCorps? Well, they'll come and do 2 or 3 years. They'll then go off and get jobs in life, and they'll come back in their 40s and 50s and say, okay, I raised my kids, we got through, we're okay, we're middle class family, but I want to do something more. I want to, because people get the bug, and they really want to be remembered for something that's. So when you leave the Kennedy School, it's not as if you have a moral obligation to go work in nonprofit, but we would like to have a sense of obligation for you to serve at some point in your life, and to do it in a way that I think others can be inspired by. And I do think, again, I come back to this, if you guys don't do it, I don't know who will. I don't know who rescues. But I do think that there is these streams of people coming in now that we ought to be looking to and say, yes, we need to help them. Let's get behind them. Let's see what we can do. Let's get our philanthropy dollars going. There are things we need to do inside the school, but there are things we need to be doing outside the school. And many of you can do that, and you can have lives that are intertwined with the school in some ways. That you become sort of a part of a bigger family here, which I think you'll find that there are a lot of people to share your aspirations. And one of the things that always interests me, and I've seen it since I've been here. I came here in '99, 2000. The quality of students here today is much higher than it was then. I'm just telling you. I'm just telling you, that's not to say, it's not about individuals. What's that?
About to get it right.
Yeah, we can have a good ride about that. It's not to say individuals don't matter, they do matter a hell of a lot. But I think the quality of people coming here, especially the Americans, I always thought the international group was pretty darn distinguished, but especially the Americans, when I first got here, I said, I'm not so sure about this. And then we had some really interesting people come through, and I really got attached to them. And now I'm seeing just a better flow. It's encouraging.
David, thank you very much. Perhaps we have, I see we have 5 people, so we get 2 more questions, yeah? One each, and we go with you, please.
Hello, I'm Jack Mills. I really appreciate this forum. I'm not sure I should admit it, but I'm a member of the class of '92. And obviously a baby boomer. I want to both thank you for the comments on service, and particularly local service. That really was an important part of my life earlier. I want to ask more about how today and going forward we can exert leadership. And my concerns are these. It seems like both domestically and internationally, there is increasing attack on democracy, on rights, human rights, on the rule of law. And so, to my mind, this may pose challenges that we haven't really faced for a while, as broadly as we do now. You've said a lot already about how to exert leadership. I wonder what else you'd add in the context of those challenges here and abroad.
Go ahead. You translate that.
Okay, so what are your thoughts about on the world we live in today, where you see a lot of pushback in relation to human rights, democracy, the rise of authoritarian regimes, and a more insular society and nations? What does that say about leadership, and what are your thoughts in relation to the way these days these societies are governing themselves?
Just not only internationally, but also domestically here in the U.S.
How we can do what?
What are your thoughts on leadership in an environment where constantly we have a pushback on democracy, on freedom, on human rights?
Well, I think Biden has been right, essentially, in arguing that what we're coming down to is a clash between authoritarianism and more traditional liberalism. And I don't think we've engaged with this anywhere near enough. And as I say, I think it has to be handled with great care. For example, when we're having real problems with the Soviet Union, they were very threatening to us. Presidents in the 60s and 70s, Nixon one of them, but there are others, Kennedy and Johnson, they appealed over the heads of the Russian leadership to the people of Russia to say it's not your leader, it's not the people of Russia. The people of Russia had a great literature, they have great athletes, they do a lot of other things that are important. It's your leaders who are spoiling your future, and you need to get new leaders. That's essentially the way they went out. They went on television in Moscow and places like that to make that kind of argument. And what I have some concern about now, a lot of concern about now, is we're creating a narrative about the Russian soldiers and about the Russians more generally as being animals. They're below humankind, and they're unacceptable, and we don't want them as athletes playing in our games and things like that. I think if we're not careful, we're going to create a permanent enemy of people we don't need to have that enemy relationship with. They live in, the Russian people live today in pretty sordid and difficult times. And there's going to be a lot of willingness, there could be a lot of unrest there. And we would I think, be well advised to try to heal our relationship with the Russian people, even as we take very seriously and attack on all fronts the authoritarianism and the brutality that Putin has come to associate himself with. But I think these things have been, I worry sometimes that, and I've seen it for years on both sides of the aisle, it's often easier to play to the headlines than it is to make the real progress. People enjoy taking a swat at somebody else, or talking about how awful the Chinese are, et cetera, et cetera. When in fact, if we're ever going to get the world to work well, we've got to be able to sit down with the Russians and with the Chinese at some point to work things out. And I don't know if we're leaving ourselves too few options to have a good way of doing this. I think that if your book bag will be full by the time I stop this, but there is a book out that I think that I invite the authors to come over and teach here at the Kennedy School for at least once a semester. The book called How Democracies Die, by Ziblatt and not Zelensky. Ziblatt and Levitsky. And it's a really, really interesting book. It plays on this idea that one is hearing more and more often, is it fundamental to all the kind of differences we have is the degree to which this is becoming a multi-ethnic society in which there's no majority. And Ziblatt and Levitsky argue that is the most, no nation which has that situation has endured as a democracy. It's hard to do. And you see it now in this Buffalo kid and the great replacement theory that he's surfacing, which goes all the way back to Bilbo and the early segregationist Jim Crow times in the South. But the notion that your gain as a black person is my loss as a white person. You're going to take my seat at the table. And that is a really, really dangerous proposition. And because what we need, we don't want to chase anybody away from the table. We need a bigger table, and places that other people can come and occupy and have an equal voice. But this notion that if you're up, I'm down, is pernicious. But I don't know. There was a survey out the other day, I think a Quinnipiac survey last week, said 1 out of every 3 Americans is scared he or she is going to be displaced in his job by some foreigner. That's the recipe for all sorts of mischief. So you're putting your finger on the right question about democracy. And that's why I think we don't have a lot of time. We need to be moving. We can't have 4 more years. If Trump came in and is just the same way he was the first time, it's going to be a mess. But I don't know if he can get people to work for him. I mean, they may kiss his ring, but otherwise.
We take the last question and then we can wrap up. Please, ma'am.
Yes, hello, Professor Gergen. Hello. Good afternoon. My name is Allison Johnson. I'm a 2-year MPA from the class of 1992. So glad to be back here for our alumni reunion. And I'm really glad that you touched on enlarging the pie in your last commentary, because that really is the answer, enlarging the table and the pie. So all 350 million Americans can participate, but also the larger international pie for all 8 billion human beings that are currently occupying this beautiful blue dot that we call planet Earth. So there is a world that works for everyone without exception. And I think that's the ultimate goal of true leadership, one where we see that world. So I first want to thank you for your service in the 1960s. I have been watching you since your arrival at school, and that story really touched my heart because it was your work, along with other valiant African Americans and other Americans of European descent, that allowed this country to open up so people like me could come to the Harvard University School of Government. So I want to thank you for that personally. And I am extremely interested in your perspective about leadership coming from the corporate environment, because sometimes the corporate leadership stumbles into their roles on a global scale because they become some of the richest people with the most resources. And I always question, how prepared are they for global leadership? How prepared are they for global leadership? If you look at Elon Musk, now the richest man on earth, approaching $300 billion in capital wealth, how prepared was he really to go to the global scale of leadership? And I wonder if that is a question to leave you and the Center for Public Leadership about how to train our corporate leaders. Because whether it's Mark Zuckerberg launching into the global, marketplace as a dropout from Harvard University, but still now one of the richest men on earth, Jeff Bezos, so many who have become leaders for the global community, but not necessarily with the training and education that you teach all of us here and many people around the world. And I pose that question because they have access to the most wealth, and with that wealth they could change the world for the good if they had that sense of corporate citizenship and corporate leadership on a global scale. So just wanted your thoughts on that, and whether there's collaboration between the law school, business school, and the School of Government on training those future corporate leaders that are really changing the world we live in every day. Thank you.
Your statement was eloquent. Thank you. It was really well stated. I think we should be very reluctant to sort of knock on Elon Musk's door and say, here, we're here from Washington to tell you how to run your company. I don't think you're going to get very far very quickly in that kind of environment. I do think, and I have some concern about the government becoming the arbiter of what's true and what's not true on the internet. I would much rather have something like a Federal Reserve, which it has representation from more across the board, and other institutions like that. So you don't get, if we start having Bezos or whatever Musk take orders from the government, it's going to get politicized really, really fast. And I think it is a mistake. What's interesting to me is that the women who are married to these guys are, coming through better than the guys in terms of their philanthropy. They're doing some smart things. Jeff Bezos' former wife has really gotten some good things off the ground. And I think that Bill Gates' wife is going to get some good things off the ground. It's an interesting proposition. I think we're sort of, though, in a stage where we ought to be asking questions about how is this going to work, and how much might it damage our democracy, how much might it limit our democracy, because there are 4 people who control 20% of the world's GDP, or some such number. But I think we ought to be asking questions and following, and letting, in 2 to 3 years from now, I think we'll know a lot better than we know now about how the world will work if they own as much as they do, and how is social media going to be governed? Because social media clearly is a two-edged sword. But go ahead. I love hearing you talk. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a suggestion. We are so impressed by the Institute of Politics and the Kennedy School of Government receiving new congressmen and new senators every term to come train here for a matter of weeks. They come together in a bipartisan educational program here. And I just had a thought about a corporate leadership training for new CEOs who are taking over multi-trillion-dollar companies who don't have a training in global leadership and what it means to be a world leader of a multi-trillion-dollar company that affects all 8 billion human beings that live here. And it could be an HLS, HBS, HKS collaboration.
I agree with that. I think it's worth noting that the business school has made some movements in that direction. Michael Porter at the business school was in charge of running a great big study of American competitiveness. And he worked on it for 2 or 3 years. And they had like 10 different issues that affect our competitiveness. And they found that almost every single one of them we did well, but what was stopping us was our politics. And it was because it was so rancid, you couldn't get good things done, things got all backed up. And out of that grew a group that HBS alums called Leadership Now. Leadership Now, there's a woman named Daniela who runs it. And I've done 2 or 3 events with them, and I've come away encouraged that the business school was graduating people who took politics much more seriously than I'd seen in the past. So I don't think this is out of reach, but I do think it requires a certain imagination on the part of our leadership of the schools and of the university about how we're going to do this. How can we have an impact that is larger than what we now have? It's a very, very good question to ask. I just don't pretend to have the answers at this point because I don't feel comfortable knowing that we have the fact. But I do think that it's a very, very good question to ask. And you know, if you all carry this to the dean or whatever, however you like to express yourself, I think that's worthwhile. People listen. I think the leadership of the university, it just generally is in more of a listening mode than people think, especially with Larry Backow, but also Dean Elbendorf.
Both HBS and HKS, believe me, I will make sure I take it to both deans.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
All right. David Gergen, thank you very much for sharing your wisdom, your thoughts, your experience, and the lessons that you put on this incredible book that I've had the fortune of reading, Hearts Touched with Fire. For many of you who don't have a copy just yet, please do not forget to follow that corridor. And if you need to have your name or a dedication, please put your name rather on the list, and David would write something for you and with your name. Thank you very much. Any perhaps parting thoughts? Any final hopeful thoughts from your side?
I started with a story, right? This is on turning 80. You can see I'm a little obsessed with that. I've gotten very sympathetic to an old fellow who was walking through the woods one day, and he heard this sound, and he couldn't see anything. Then he heard it again, looked down. There was a frog by the side of the path. And the frog looked up at him and said, "If you kiss me, I'll turn into a beautiful princess." And he said, "Terrific." Reached down, scoops up the frog, puts it in his pocket. Frog is puzzled, crawls up his jacket. "Didn't you hear me? I said, if you kiss me, I'll turn into a beautiful princess." "Yeah, I heard you all right, but at my age, I'd rather have a talking frog." That's where we are.